Okay, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening for our cattle handling webinar. My name's Leah Shanks. I am AHDB's Knowledge Exchange Manager for Beef and Lamb in the Southwest, and we are also joined tonight by my colleague Chloe, who's going to look after the technical aspects and ask your questions. We'll be also joined by David Barton, our strategic farmer from Gloucestershire, and also Miriam Parker, Livestock Wise Limited, and our cattle handling specialist. Tonight, the webinar is brought to you by both Beef and Lamb and Dairy from AHDB. And I'm just going to run through a few aspects of the software before we make a proper start. So on this screen here, this gives you a bit of instruction. So that orange arrow that should probably appear on your top right-hand corner of your screen, that arrow allows you to enlarge and reduce the size of your control panel there. You will be muted throughout and your cameras will be off, but you will be able to ask questions. So if you can't see the question box, you click on that orange arrow, that opens that box up, and you'll see a drop-down arrow on questions. You can then type your question in and then click send on the bottom right-hand corner. Please ask your questions throughout the webinar this evening, and we'll find time to answer those for you. If you have any trouble this evening with hearing us or seeing us or anything like that, any technical issues, please also type those in the question box, and Chloe will try and help you there. If you have any real struggles, sometimes it's best to log out and log back in. This recording will be saved and uploaded to YouTube, so you can view back at another time. And just to say, we will try and make this webinar interactive for you this evening, so there'll be some polls for you to take part in, and we're also going to be showing some video footage. I'm aware that if you have a low bandwidth where you are, the video footage might not come through, so we'll narrate that for you. But just to say, the video footage isn't essential for tonight's viewing, so if you don't see it, please don't worry. We're going to talk it through anyway. So, Chloe, if we can start with the first poll, please. I think I need to stop sharing my screen.
Yeah, we've got the votes coming in, Leah, so
oh, you can see it.
Okay. Yeah, just give it a couple more seconds.
Okay, brilliant. I can't see it to read it out, Chloe. Can you read the question out, please?
Yes, so what is the main reason for wanting to improve your handling system? So the options we've got is cattle behaviour, reducing stress, animal monitoring, safe working environment, and reduced labour. So the majority of the audience have voted now, so I'll share those results. So the winning vote is to reduce stress. That's the main reason for our audience tonight that are wanting to improve their handling system. So 58% of listeners tonight. Oh, sorry, I read that wrong. 75% is the safe working environment. That's the majority vote, followed by reducing stress, animal monitoring, cattle behaviour, and reducing labour coming in fourth place.
Okay. So Chloe, can you still see my screen, or has it stopped?
You need to share your screen again.
Can you? But I don't want to share it. Can you see it?
I can see you. Yep.
You can see me. Okay. Okay. So we'll make a start then. So I'd like to introduce David Barton. So David, if you could switch your camera on, please. Hello. So David joins us tonight from Gloucestershire, and David is our strategic farmer for beef and lamb. David, please, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and about your farm?
Sure. So we have a mixed family farm and growing some cereals, wheat and barley, and we have a suckler herd of around about 70 cows. They are Salers crossed with Devons and Sussex, and we are finishing all the cattle for Dovecot Park, and that's sort of a very brief outline of what we're doing on the farm, Leah.
Okay, so in terms of your current cattle handling system, David, so your beef, not dairy, however, it applies to both. So tell us about your current system. What does that look like?
Okay, so I put up some new cattle buildings around about 5 years ago with the intention of putting in a permanent system, and for a number of reasons that didn't happen. So we have really what is a temporary system. We've actually got a very good crush, and we use hurdles, sliding gates, and what have you. So it works okay, but it's not as good as it could be, and so that's basically it, Leah.
Okay, and given that it's temporary, it's obviously been working for you. So what has been working well in that system?
Okay, so it works well in the fact that I can get all the cattle from my buildings easily to it, and the crush itself is very good. It's a manual squeeze crush, and that's really good. And actually, fitting into crush is okay, but it's behind that we start having problems.
Okay, so tell us then, what doesn't work so well with the current system?
So there's a couple of things really. It's difficult to feed cattle into the race, because and we'll sort of learn about more of this later on, I guess. But we've basically got too much room, and that's been the problem. The other thing is, of course, is that currently personnel have to get in behind the cattle to encourage them to go down the race, which isn't ideal. So that there are the two sort of main things really. They don't feed into the race as well as they should do, and we've got to have people in amongst the cattle, which is not ideal, and we want to move away from that.
So with the labour on your farm, David, what does that look like? Who do you need help with, or can you do it all on your own?
No, my wife Churi helps, and we get people in to help, when we're TB testing, etc. But ideally, we want a system that I could actually weigh cattle on my own without any other help, and reduce labour, or to be as much as possible. That's another key aspect for us.
Okay, so David, about 6 to 9 months ago, you came to me with this idea that we'd collaborate on improving cattle handling systems on a bit of a budget or at a lower cost. Why was that? Why don't you just apply for a grant or a subsidy just to cover those costs for you?
Okay, so I did actually apply for the I can't remember what they call it, small capital grant scheme, small capital grant scheme, or whatever it's called. And I was successful in getting a grant. The problem I then found was that manufacturers became incredibly busy. I couldn't actually get the equipment in time, and then the system was really overloaded. But the biggest problem for me was that I had manufacturers come out, and they had a sort of standard set of equipment that they wanted to sell me, and they wanted to try and drop it into my farm, and it just didn't work. Wherever we tried to put this sort of standard system, which I'm sure works very well, it didn't work very well on my farm, and I couldn't feed cattle in and out of it from my yards as I wanted to, and it was quite expensive. And I just thought, I'm going to spend a lot of money here, and I don't like what I'm seeing. So in the end, I decided to withdraw from that, and I looked at it and thought, well, I'm sure we can do something better for a lot less money than having, it's quite nice to have the grant money, but you have to spend quite a lot of money to get it. And we have quite a lot of equipment anyway on farm, and it sort of, it didn't really, it wasn't working for us anyway. So I thought we'd have a look at trying to do something different, and which is sort of where we've got to now, Leah. And I think also the one thing that was really missing in that grant system is they were very specific about what they wanted you to have, but there was no scope for actually or encouragement to have a professional come in and look at your yards and see and design a system, because most farms will need a bespoke system. A lot of it, you know, yeah, you can get off the shelf, but it will need to be just a little bit different on each farm. So and I think that was, you know, that was the key for me. We needed to get some professional advice on just how to make this work really well, because when I do it, I want it to work absolutely 100% safe for the cattle, for the people using it, for us, and it to just flow through and work really well.
So that's where Miriam comes in then. So we enlisted the help of Miriam. Chloe, should we stop for questions just before we speak to Miriam, or are there any?
No questions at the moment.
Okay, brilliant. So Miriam's joined us now. Hi, Miriam.
Hi.
Can you just introduce yourself, please? What's your role? What do you do?
Well, I run my own company. It's called Livestock Wise, and been in existence about 20 years. And the main bulk of the work is design, training, all around sort of cattle handling, cattle behaviour. So everything from new designs to troubleshooting and sort of knowledge transfer type projects.
And we met on farm at David's about two weeks ago now, wasn't it? Very socially distanced, abided by the rules, and we had a look around, and we took a few videos for tonight's webinar. So if we start, Chloe, with the first video, and Miriam, if you could kindly narrate what we're seeing within this video. Mute.
Yeah, so what we asked the camera crew to do was just sort of take the cow's eye view of the current sort of setup, and it's really a semi-temporary setup in the middle of what would have been a feed passage. So this is just coming down, so you're bringing cattle down towards one end of the shed, and then and you can see how our cow is, forget the hay for the time being, but there is an obvious way out straight in front of us. But we're going to then try and ask the animals to turn 180 degrees back to where they've come from, but it's a right-handed turn. So now you can see the turn, and you can see us heading back. Oops, still looking for that corner where there's lots of light. And this is now coming into what I would call the crowd pen area, and this is where the difficulty arises, as David says, and you can see why. It's because you've got quite a lot of distraction. In other words, it's not immediately clear where exactly the animals are expected to go. And then we start moving up the race, and again this section works reasonably well because you've got a bit of solid sides on the left hand side. Again, we're looking for distraction. We've got animals on the left hand side as well, so that potentially could be another distraction. So the slidey doors, you know, you can imagine if people were actually working in that area, then the cattle would be able to see all of them, and you know, they may want to lean a little bit out towards that right hand side. Flooring's all the same, albeit, you know, just good old straw and farmyard doodah. So then coming up, this is where we get a glimpse of the fact that we've actually got something in next door to us. But you can see as we look, because of the way the front of the crush is designed, but also the gate beyond it, from the cattle perspective, that looks like we're sort of heading towards a dead end. And I know David before has said we have light issues sometimes depending on the time of day sort of coming into that. But, you know, that might be a little bit of an issue as we go a little bit further forward. But you can see where the amount of distraction is getting through that system. So, oh, there you are, Mr. Bull. So again, you know, if there is animals that happens to be either side of the handling system when you're handling, it could be a distraction, and then that's us forward, and you can see how that visually looks like there is nowhere to go, and that's looking outside. And of course, what you can see here is quite a massive area that David has got to cover to actually get animals down and turned and round through the system. And I think that is one of the issues that we're trying to address. So hopefully that's given people an idea of what David has got.
Okay, brilliant. So given we've just seen some footage of that, David, describe for us again the real pinpoints of issues that you have with the system. When cows go through it, what are they doing? You know, where are they getting stuck? Where are they turning around?
Yeah, okay. The main problem is that is feeding them into the sort of into that race area, and sometimes we actually we make it smaller at the top end there, but nevertheless there's basically too much room, so the cattle will just go round and round. They won't actually feed into the pen, into the race properly, and if they're not doing that, they're very soon, you know, that if they start to get a little bit worked up, then you know it all gets quite stressful. So it's not always like that. Sometimes they'll feed through quite well, but and as you can see, if we open the door at the end, that would help as well. But sometimes they can go quite a long way when they go out of that door. So if you're, depending on what we're doing with the cattle, if one happens to sort of skip through the crush quite quickly, then we don't want it escaping. So it's just, you know, there are design faults there, obviously, and it can be much improved, and that's, you know, that's what we're looking to do. So it is really, I want the cattle to want to go down there, and currently they don't really want to. They've got to be encouraged, and that's, you know, what we want to have is a system that that they just feed into naturally and they go straight through, and that will make life a lot easier.
Okay, so Miriam, tell us why cattle wouldn't want to go into that system.
Well, as I say, so looking at this, I think there's two issues. One is it's quite difficult for when we were on the farm, you know, I kept saying to David, when it comes to sort of covering an area for your sort of holding lanes, you know, my little rule of thumb is 10 foot, 12 foot man on foot. So if you have to start to cover an area of more than that 12 foot, then that gives animals an opportunity to turn. And clearly that's one of the big problems, is that we actually haven't got animals sort of focused in a sort of a nice alley before we actually hit the crowd pen in the first place. So, you know, there's too many opportunities, shall we say, to go right, to turn back and see a wider space and more space. So that would be number one. Number two is, again, looking at the video, and people can see this, that, you know, as they just make that little turn, it is not immediately clear that exactly where the race is. And although you've got some shielding on the left hand side and the angle of the gate is not too bad, the fact of the matter is that it's opened. It means that they go, well, I want to go out there. So you're not focusing the cattle where they need to be. And that's important because of the vision of the animal. It has that binocular vision. It is only clear in that sort of 30 to 40 degree span. So the more we can go, right, that's where we want to go at particularly at these critical points, then the easier it will be. The other thing is, you know, and it's not always possible to do it, but, you know, there is work out there that says in a handling scenario, cattle often have a preference to go left-handed round something. And so this is a right-handed turn we're asking them to do as well. So, you know, that may have a little bit of an influence as well. So those would be the sort of the main ones. These are not uncommon problems, you know, particularly that crowd pen area. And I think, you know, where you can't get your animals sort of focus where to go, then that sort of, when you're handling, you sort of get slightly anxious at the same time. And the more anxious the handler is, then the less low stress it gets, and you're sort of, you know, you're on the back foot before you even start. Is that a fair comment?
So you mentioned there, Miriam, that some of those issues, they're not uncommon. You see them maybe quite often. Is there anything else for the benefit of the audience that you see quite frequently as an issue?
I mean, again, it's sort of what I would suggest to people, and that's why we got the camera crew to do it, is, you know, just walk through the system as a starter for 10, because you know the way that that system looks once you've taken the camera through it or gone with that sort of idea in your head, the better you are to see clearly that that's where our problem area might be. So I would always say, you know, look at your system, pay attention to where the animals are not going, and then go and look at those specific bits. And you know, if you're thinking it from the cow's point of view, then hopefully that's going to highlight where your problems are. And it's, you know, sometimes what we do is handling goes well, so we don't worry, tick the box and move on. Then we have a bad day, we try and forget about it, and we don't go back and actually address the problem, you know, in a sort of objective way, really.
Okay, so now we know the issues that David's experiencing and some of the reasons why. We want to fix those. So Chloe, if we can take a look at video 2. And David, if you could narrate this for us and just describe what we're going to see.
Okay, well that's a sort of
Sorry, David, you've gone on to mute accidentally.
how's that? Okay, so that's an overview of the buildings that we currently have, and I think the red line is showing some options to where we could put handling systems, and
Sorry, David, you're muted again. I think it's the software. It's not us. I think when the video starts playing, it just mutes us. It's done it again. I'll have to keep an eye on that button there. So just on the screen here now, we've got a sort of bird's eye view of your buildings, and you were saying the red areas, these are sort of your options of where you could develop perhaps a new system or an improved system. Is that right?
that's correct. So the first area that went red is currently that's cattle housing, and we could put it undercover in there. That's one option we've looked at. Also, the red line running around the outside of the buildings is another option, which which we're looking at, that would that I quite like, but currently it's not undercover. We do have an overhang that came off of one of the buildings that would actually fit on there, but I'm not sure that would actually be wide enough to really do the job. But we've also looked at another option which isn't in red there, which is actually at the end of the building to the right, just by the red line. We could look at putting something inside there. I think my slight reluctance to putting it inside one of the cattle housing buildings is losing space for cattle housing, and I'm just trying to get my head around whether I should do that or whether I should put it outside. So we're at the moment, I'm undecided on that. It makes a lot of sense to put it inside, but at the same time I'm losing space for the cows. So yes, that's what it is, Leah.
Okay, so thanks, David. For the benefit of the audience there, sorry that our microphones were muted. On my screen, certainly the video appeared underneath our cameras. So if you couldn't see it, you might just have to move our cameras out of the way. Okay, so we've got another video to show you now, and we took this when we were on farm, and this is the sort of experience we had. So David, again, if you could narrate what we're going to see in this video here. We're muted again.
Yep. Okay, here we go.
Here we are.
That's the normally when I bring cattle in from pasture, that's where they're coming into, and we would take them into either the middle or the door on the left hand side into one of those buildings. The current system is actually in the middle there. We're looking now, that's the outside. And this is an area that we're looking at that we could possibly bring the cattle down towards us on the outside of that building, having a longer race. So we're looking to go down. That's it. The way we're walking now, that's about 100 feet that run down there, and to have a couple of pens and a race and a crush, and then options to split cattle out as they go through the system. But it's important for me that I can pull them out of those other buildings and bring them into the system, and then back round, and you know, so I can keep the cattle moving around without having to cross over at any point during the sort of their transition through the system. That's quite important. So if you're looking at that now, they could come out of any of the buildings and go down that system, and then the shop we saw at the beginning, they can come back into it. I've also got some cattle housing to the right of what we can see now, but they could also come around into it from here and into there. So that's why I think they need to come into the system needs to be on that corner, either bringing them into that end, as I mentioned earlier, undercover, or around the outside of the buildings. I'm not really explaining that very well, but I hope that makes sense.
Sorry, it went quite fast actually, didn't it? Maybe we need to slow it down next time. But the point of that was just to demonstrate that you've got some options. Basically, there's a few different areas that you could develop, and is trying to decide which one is the best option for you. So Miriam, you're not on mute, that's good. I'm going to share my screen again and share your sketch, which gives another bit of detail. If I can, Chloe. Oh. Okay, can you see my screen now?
Yeah, you're just on the ask a question. Yeah, you're on the drawing now.
Okay, Miriam, so if you can just describe this is your drawing. Oh,
yeah, I think I'm not muted. I'm go. Yes, I think it's one of the things that David said at the very beginning was the fact that, you know, sometimes we can get, you know, a system design that we know works, but the problem is where to put the system, and that tends to be, in my experience, one of the bigger issues here. Is because it's all very well having a system, but then it's going, right, how do we get animals in and how do we get out and how do we cope with expansion? So all I did was this little sketch to show you exactly, you know, where David sort of currently brings thing into a system. So he's got field access, and bearing in mind that these buildings will be virtually empty through the summer months, it means that he can bring animals in from the field where it says housing, that he can actually hold cattle for a big TB test or something like that, with all the penning on either side. But also then he's got a young stock shed opposite, and he's then also got another access route that he's bringing from this other building. So, you know, sometimes it's a bit more complex than just, as David said, just planting that in, because you've got to bring animals from all different routes. So I think, you know, one of the take-home messages for people is to just sketch out where you absolutely want to and need to bring animals to and from the buildings. And the next thing that we sort of discussed on the day was future expansion. And yes, it may not happen in the next 5 years or the next 10 years, but if you've got children coming on or what have you, it is worth looking at saying, right, if we're going to expand, where would we put our buildings? And then that starts to take out certain of the sites. So I don't know if my mouse works on this, but you know, so the red area that we identified on the sort of top left of this is where David suggested that if he's going to put another shed, he would go. At the moment, the bank on the right hand side of the drawing, where you potentially could put something right the way along, you know, at a later stage the bank could be moved out and this handling area could be covered if you wanted to. It means that the system is not interrupting sort of flows coming, and you can still use the housing areas for, you know, holding one way or another. you know, for these big handling events, but it would still be accessible for anything coming across that young stock shed or the access route. And I think the big drama here is when are you going to handle it, who are you going to handle more often? So, you know, we had a bit of a debate about regular weighing, and that might be one of the things you want to be able to do more often. So, you know, it is a decision on, you know, what do I need to do, when do I need to do it, and what groups of animals do I need to do it most often with. But also understanding how animals might have to flow in and out of the buildings. And, you know, everybody can pop up a little sketch like this to get an idea of where, you know, the most of their animals are moving at any one time. So does that help clarify my thinking?
I think so.
Or do you want to go through our options?
I think so we're very much at the point right now where you know, you've got a decision to make, David. There are lots of different options on the table, and we're certainly not going to make a decision this evening. But something else that you said to me those 6 to 9 months ago were that you think you've already got materials on farm that you can reuse, repurpose, recycle to help you build this system, rather than, you know, applying for this grant for some shiny new kit. So tell us a bit more about those materials. What do you think you can reuse?
Okay, so yeah, I think actually most of what I've got is perfectly serviceable. Most of it's galvanized steel, and you know, we have a crush, we have a service box, we have a couple of sliding gates, and gate other sorts of gates in the system as well, which you know, I think we need to obviously use some stock board and fill the bottoms in so they're solid, so the cattle, you know, that would help them, the cattle feed down through that race. But there's no reason why we can't actually use most of what I've got there, and then just actually purchase the things that we actually need to make sure that the system works really well. And you know, hopefully, you know, Miriam's going to sort of guide me in that direction. And so I don't think I should need to spend tens of thousands to get this up and running. And it's all about the detail of where it goes. So everything I think we have currently on farm can easily be reused in the system. And sure, we will need to buy some new stuff, and I'm not, you know, that isn't a problem. It's just making good use of what we currently have, so long as it's serviceable and it's fit for purpose, which I think it is. You know, it makes perfect sense to me, really. I mean, a lot of us on farm will have a certain amount of equipment that we can use, and there's no need to discard it just because you know, it should be built into the system that you're going to use.
Good. Okay, so there was definitely a piece of equipment that was a bit controversial on the day that we spoke about, which was an overhang that you had lying around. So where's that overhang? What has that come from?
Well, the one of my buildings was a sort of standard cattle shed, which is 100 by 40 with a 5-foot overhang. They're very common. We then put up another building opposite it and covered the middle in, so sort of covered yard. That's what we've currently got. So that came off of the front of the building, and I'm, you know, seriously considering making my handling equipment go down the outside of that one. So it could actually go on the back of it. Came off the front, so we could actually put that on, and it would give us sort of a 5-foot cover, which probably would be okay for where the cattle go down, but it wouldn't probably be enough to cover the crush area, which is the most important bit. So it may or may not work. And I think Miriam also pointed out that it could have an effect with if it's not fully covered, the light could distract the cattle going down. So it may actually be better for us to at some point actually just go a little bit further out and cover that area completely with a proper sort of lean-to, which wouldn't be too difficult. But so yeah, it's there. We may or may not use that. I don't know, Leah.
So that was something we didn't think of, was it? That the difference between the light going from dark to light or light to dark. So Miriam, can you tell us a bit more about that? Why don't cows like the change of light?
Well, I think you know, again, it's part of the design process that, you know, whether you've got a roof now or whether you want to put one on, it's quite critical to even if you think you might put a roof on later on, it's just to think about how you can do it over the facility. So, you know, at certain times of the day, you might have quite high contrast. So the animals are moving from quite a bright area into quite a dark area, or the other way around. And so that sudden change of contrast can actually stop animals moving. And particularly, you know, if we looked at our, you know, trying to run our crush up on that right hand side with a 5-foot overhang, yes, it might go over the crush, but the real trigger point where there might be a problem is where, again, you're coming from the crowd area, trying to narrow them down into the race. So I always say to people, try and, you know, plan where your overhead is going to be, even though you might never build it, just to make sure that where you're going to put it is actually not going to be on over some of the critical areas. So, you know, somewhere down the holding alley, that's not so much of a problem. But if you end up having sharp contrast just as you're trying to get animals to go in or out of the crush, or just as you're trying to get them to go in and out of the raceway, it's probably going to get, you know, it's more like it's a sort of a problem that you can anticipate almost. You know, and a lot of people have a really good system and then suddenly put a little bit of a cover over it, and they get a few stopping points after that.
Thank you. Chloe, you've joined us now. Does that mean we've got some questions coming in?
We've just had one come in. Yes, it's for David and Miriam. So David, do you have issues with smaller cattle and calves turning in the race? And then a question for Miriam is, you know, this person's considering putting a race between their forcing pen and their crush, but they think it needs to be adjustable. And have you got any advice there?
Okay, so the answer to that is with suckler cows, yes, that is a problem. Small calves or young suckle calves do like to turn around and in the race just at the point that they're going to go into the crush, and that is yeah, particular problem. So I have seen you know, races that are adjustable, squeeze races if you like, that are great, but they are quite expensive. So yeah, I'd be very keen to hear how Miriam's going to overcome that problem for me.
What's the budget?
Yeah,
I mean, you know, commonly asked question, because, you know, particularly if you've got sucklers, you're trying to design hardware around some software that changes size. And, you know, my usual analogy is, you know, using the toilets at the primary school for the adults is always a bit of a challenge. So your options are, and it depends on numbers and how it is to have a specific race that you can switch across to handle calves, but that means that you're having to batch them anyway. But for people rearing big lumps of livestock, that might be a possibility. The second one is to buy the kit that already has the full adjustment in it. So in other words, you're spending your money on something that is going to deliver what you need. And then, you know, farmers being remarkably inventive characters, you can make it so that you can slot the sides. You know, you can either have a lift-in partition. I've seen people manage to engineer that sort of thing. The simplest one I've seen, and it was up in a farm in Wales, was simply putting, if you've got a wall that your race is against, or even some uprights, is to put a series of horizontal wooden battens getting wider towards the bottom, then sticking your stock board on, and effectively you've got one straight side and one side in at an angle, which means, you know, as the animal gets bigger, the space gets wider. The critical thing about that is making sure you measure your cattle, and that sounds a little bit bizarre, but, you know, there's no point going and looking at, if you've got Limousins, looking at Herefords, and if you've got something that's slightly tall and leggy. So just roughly measuring, you know, heights at the shoulders, and then you can tweak it to what you want. But those are so organise something yourself, you can buy it, or you can actually split the system to be more animal specific, depending on what you do. And that's why you always go back and go, right, what do I need my system to do? What should it be able to do? And what would I really like it to do? So it's what the essentials are for you.
Thanks both. We've just got another question as well. It's how long should a race be, please, Miriam, and how many head of cattle should it hold?
Right, okay, so again, I'll start from the software. The little bit of work we've done that's been done historically is that usually 8 to 10 minutes standing single file in a race is enough to elevate the heart rate. So this is not so much about how long the race should be, it's how long they're standing in the race. So people that are doing finishing operations, that are weighing and doing something fairly fast, they can get away with a longer race because the time spent in the race is shorter, because the time spent on the crush is something that's pretty fast. Then likewise, if you've got something, if you want to clip cattle and you've got small numbers, then probably a shorter race, that might be 3 or 4 cattle rather than maybe 8 or 10. Because if you're spending a minute or minute and a half or something in the crush, then you don't want the animals to be waiting for too long. Your strategic approach after that is to have a couple of gates so you can subdivide. So sometimes you can have a longer race, or sometimes you can have a shorter race. And then the other one to consider is what your crowd pen capacity is. And I always try and say, right, let's match, your batch size with your crowd pen with your race length. So, if you've got a sort of a 10-foot crowd pen or whatever the size it is, if it comfortably takes 5 of the size of your cattle, well, 4 in the race, 1 in the crush, 1 on the outside, that's about roughly what you're doing. Dimensions wise, you're looking about what we call 1.8 to 2 meters for an adult animal. So 1.8 allows them to, stick their head on the rump of the animal in front, and 2 meters gives them a little bit more room. So you're sort of roughly that. But to me, it's the time spent in the race which is the thing you've got to manage.
Thank you, Miriam. That's really useful. That's it for now.
Miriam, I'd be interested to know from your experience, apart from size, is there any difference between designing a cattle handling system for dairy opposed to beef? Is there anything else to consider apart from size?
I think the huge difference is with dairy cattle, taking young stock out for the moment, your dairy cattle have got, hours and hours of learning. So maybe some of the things that would be very important in a, like sheeting and bits and pieces would be pretty important in a suckler setup or a finishing setup, wouldn't necessarily be as essential in some places, because the dairy cows, they get to learn the system. So I think that's the thing is if the cattle are learning the system, and you're handling them as they're coming out of the parlour or what have you, then you've got to look at the learning more than the sort of what does it look like really. And I think it's important then to make sure that we don't suddenly divert the cows into something that they've never been on just before a TB test. So trying to keep all the handling processes as part of what you do, and exploiting the fact that your cattle learn about moving through these systems, and sometimes moving them through a system occasionally just for let's just go that way for a change, so that they've nothing to worry about. So I think that's the big difference, is you can probably get away with a little bit more, less pernickety with the dairy cows, and I'm talking about the adults, than you can with a young stock with the heifers and maybe a suckler system, because you can embed learning.
Okay. We spoke about light, and that cattle naturally want to filter through to the light. Are there any other mechanisms we can use or employ to sort of reward cattle for going through the system and passing through, getting to the end?
Well, I mean, in terms of layout, again, you know, David's existing system, although it's going right-handed, you know, one of our biggest exploits is the bounce back. So in other words, in terms of layout and orientation, is that you know, if you put cattle into a pen, once you stick them in the pen, they generally their instinct is just to turn around and come back out at you. So essentially laying out your handling system so that you're exploiting that we're going into something, but we're going to turn 180 degrees and go back out. Now that might be over a short distance, or it might be round a building, but you're still doing the same thing. So they're going back out to where they came from. So that's a, you know, that's a sort of key strategy that a lot of systems can exploit. And it's just to me, it's just saying, right, okay, so can these guys see a way out? Is it clear? And I think if we still keep going back to the vision, you know, that you are dealing with something that is, you know, maybe 500 kilos with a sight disability. So you sort of have to help it along a little bit as to making sure that the route that you want them to go is absolutely clear, and it's something that then they're going to use.
Okay, so drawing on that a little bit more then, and talking about safety, what more could David be doing to make the experience safer for both cattle and for both him and Churi as well?
Right, okay, so you know, I think all the way through this, our big safety critical areas are usually, you know, in terms of the alleys and getting animals into the crowd pen. And so I have a little, anywhere you've got people in with cattle, ideally you're looking, my little mantra is under, over, behind or through. And that's your dynamic risk assessment. So wherever you've got cattle and people, you need to, you know, can we get out of that space quickly and easily? And that is a dynamic risk assessment. So in other words, what might work for, you know, young farmer, 30-ish, might not work for father or grandfather. So it's got to be dynamic. Particularly when it comes to the crowd areas, that is where that things can get a bit difficult. And I would like to see anywhere you've put sheeted sides on or things like that, that should be a no-go area for anybody, because if you're sheeting things to direct the cattle, if you're in there, you will not be able to get out. And so once you start sheeting things, you've got to be very careful to make sure you've still got your potential escape routes. And the crowd area before the race is one of those critical areas where that's why the design needs to be, you know, well thought through. Coming through the race again, you know, you should have an exit strategy. So where are animals going to go? And particularly to make sure that you've got a safe, protected working area, so that, you know, cattle can't come out back and sort of help fill in paperwork or what have you, and you've got somewhere, you know, that's going to be sort of cattle proof. And I would have said those are the key areas. So, you know, anywhere with you're in, can you get out? Crowd pens, try and design them so that you can operate from the outside. You know, anywhere you're sheeted sides, make sure you've got your escape route, exit strategy, and a safe working area. And those would be the big critical ones for me. Apart from the fact, of course, it's got to be, you know, strong enough and secure enough and high enough to contain the cattle. And that may seem blindingly obvious, but if we walk into a farm and see lots of, should we say, slightly bent gates, then we know that for those cattle, it's slightly not good enough. So
we spoke about, for David, it's very important that he can repurpose some equipment he's got lying around on farm and what he's currently using. From your experience, Miriam, what have other farmers repurposed? What could be used in a cattle handling system? I've heard of motorway crash barriers.
Yeah, well, I mean, going for motorway crash barriers, great. You have to be very careful because they can be quite sharp at times. When you're using them, you know, they're not always the easiest things to get over if from an escape route point of view, but you can butt them up quite well to actually almost make solid sides. So yeah, we've had large bits of drain pipe cut in quarters, and that we use that to bend round something. We've used an old circular dairy crowd pen, and that's been repurposed. You know, generally speaking, if you've got on a budget, the best thing to do is have a good old walk around the farm, and you're quite surprised how much kit there might be there that you can actually play with. You know, if you're fairly inventive, but you know, whatever's available really. If you know, looking at the photographs of David's system, people will be able to see that you've got, you know, probably nearly 50% of the element that you need there in terms of hurdles and bits and pieces like that. So it's just a case of adding to that, and you know, and they're in good order and they're of decent height and they're strong enough so that you know, in terms of reusing them. So you know, the challenge for David, I think, in the short term would be just lift that up and put it on the left-hand side and see if it works a bit better.
Chloe, have we got any more questions coming through?
Not at the moment.
Okay. Miriam, are there any more key points that you would like to make?
I think I'll just reiterate, you know, for those that you know, because the title is Improving Cattle Handling on a Budget, it is basically to sort of sit down first of all and think, what do you need out your system? Because I think sometimes if you know, we probably don't get objective enough about, right, what do I actually absolutely need it to do, and then what would I really like it to do. One of the things that we had a little bit of a conversation with David is also things like loading and unloading, because that's becoming more of a potential safety issue. If you're having a large vehicle coming onto farm, you know, can that person, you know, your driver and what have you, load those animals safely at all hours of the day or night, as sometimes happens. So, you know, sometimes I'm trying to persuade people to look a little bit beyond than just the system, but you know, what other things can we incorporate into it to tick off some of those boxes, rather than thinking of just of cattle handling. But you know, we might handle animals to load them, and we might have to handle bulls, which you know, how do we incorporate bits to make that job easier to do? So, and again, time spent with a big long list of, you know, what would I really like things to be able to do, and a wish list is a good way, because then when we start to design a system, you can sort of help tick off the boxes a little bit, rather than going in and going, right, well, you see a list of, you see a design and we'll go, right, well, that'll do, but can it do all the things you need it to do?
Yeah, that sounds like a good way to approach things. Chloe, have you got a question there?
Yeah, we've now got a couple of questions come in. So the first one, Miriam, how do you stop a second animal squashing the first in the crush, so doubling up?
Aha. My big question is why they're doing that in the first place. So again, you know, we can design a lot of hardware, but we can, you know, in terms of software, so it might be this frustration from the animal, in other words, that they've been standing around too long, or they're not moving fast enough. You know, there's a sort of tolerance limit there. You are going to get it. You can't say to animals, don't push in the queue. But it sort of would indicate that maybe things are on a slightly high flight mode, as opposed to sort of, you know, just wandering through. So when we look at facilities is one thing, but it's also looking at you know, what sort of anxiety state are your animals in by the time we get there, and if we can reduce that a little bit and go, no, it's okay, just chill, then you should get less of that, really.
Can I just add, we use we have a sliding door actually on the crush itself, so that does help quite a bit if they are trying to bunch up a bit. When one comes onto the crush, you can rather than having a gate that comes behind it, sliding door on the crush itself helps quite a bit.
I mean, you should have a, you know, from a safety perspective, you should have a gate on the back of the crush anyway. So, you know, that's, you know, your crush needs to have a floor, a front grate, and a back retainer. It might indicate that maybe the race is a little bit wide, or going from the race into the crush, it looks like there's a little bit more room sort of to push through. But from a safety, so again, if you're looking at sort of David's system, you know, when we redesign, I'd be looking to put a sliding gate as you as animals come out of the crowd pen into the race, and then potentially another one somewhere near the crush, simply because it gives you a bit more control. And I say stops the, I mean, the other thing we talked about with David was actually doing sort of, you know, almost another inline system. So you can put like a weigh scale before, like a mini holding section before the crush, or possibly one after it, and that then starts to help control the animals into the crush, and they learn then it's not all about getting into the crush and going through as fast as you can.
Thanks both. And David, that sliding door, is that something that came with a fairly new crush, or is that something you added on afterwards?
Yeah, no, it was an option on the crush that we had, and I have to say it's worked really well. And what we actually do is we've got another sliding door, so we try to have just one animal ready to come into the crush, and then we've got 4 or 5 in the race as well. So that in itself actually works quite well. We've got a kiosk as well, so we can hold an animal ready to come into the crush. The vet can access the back of the crush if he needs to, if he's doing something, PDing or whatever. But inevitably you get one that's a bit rude and they decide they're coming in together. But the sliding doors certainly help an awful lot, because if you've got just a gate on the back of your crush and you've got to bring it round, that in itself can be quite tricky and dangerous. So yeah, I'd really recommend the sliding door on the crush itself. And as Miriam said, we'll need a couple more at the race as well.
Chloe, I'm conscious of time. Could you please put up the second poll for the audience?
Yes, I do have a couple more questions, but we can pop that back to those in a second.
Okay.
So hopefully you can see the second poll. What further advice would you find useful for improving handling on your farm? So it'd be really great if you could answer this one, please, and hopefully we can provide any extra advice if it's needed. So your options are understanding cattle behaviour, staff training for handling, reducing cattle stress, designing new handling systems, and updating existing handling systems. And you can vote for more than one option. Thanks everyone. So we've got some votes coming in. I'll just give it a couple more seconds. Okay, so we've got the results. So extra advice needed is really to update existing handling systems. That's 57% of our audience, followed by reducing cattle stress, 52%, and then designing new systems, followed by staff training and understanding cattle behaviour.
Okay, thank you everyone. We can feed that back to our R&D team. Would you like to ask a few final questions, Chloe? We're very short on time, so we might have maybe 5 more minutes of questions and then we'll finish up.
Yeah, they should be quite quick. So Miriam, just any advice on changing gradients? So do cattle have a preference to go uphill or downhill, or is level ground best?
Okay, so because of the weight of the animal on the head and the forequarter and the instinctive fear of falling, going downhill is something that cattle don't like. And I'm talking about, you know, if you can feel the gradient, then the cattle will go right. They're going to be a bit reluctant. So if you have to, it's better to put the downhill through the holding lane and then turn them uphill through the race. So definitely races going uphill or on the level, and on the level is fine as well. So some people say that they actually run slightly better up the hill, but you know, you don't have to build hills if you're level, I think. And usually the bigger challenge is trying to, you know, sort things out on an unlevel site. So yes, level, uphill, and try and avoid downhill as much as possible, particularly down races and into crushes.
Thank you. And is there an optimum time for animals to cool off between yarding and working? So this person says their vet was late for their last TB test, but it actually went better.
It's called boredom. And it sounds a bit bizarre, but I've heard a lot of people say this, is that, you know, when you bring the animals in, going straight from sort of doing all of that to actually getting started, sometimes if you bring them in and let them settle and go away and leave them, then by the time you come to get started, they actually want to get out. And you know, they're sort of getting a little bit sort of, okay, well, they get frustrated, and you know, they have settled down because, you know, just even the activity is going to raise the heart rate, etc., etc. And so therefore they can, you know, they focus a little bit better maybe when they've sort of had time to settle. And that anecdotal evidence is quite strong. Lots and lots of people, even handling sheep, would say bring them in, have a cup of tea, and then go out and start and do it. And whether it's because they've settled or because they want to get out of there, it doesn't, you know, doesn't matter. It seems to work.
Thanks, Miriam. And last question, very quickly, considerations for flooring, please.
Non-slip. So how you assess that basically, are your cattle slipping or are they not? So again, that's back to the instinctive fear of falling. So, you know, cattle are worried about falling down because you're either going to get eaten or trampled on or injured. So, and it really is going, right, okay, so, you know, what have we got? What can we use? But also then watch the cattle, because the cattle will, and it can work two ways. Either the floor's the main problem or the handling's the main problem. So good handlers on the slippery floors, cows will not slip. You know, bad handlers on a good floor can still make cattle slip. So again, the evaluation should be, where are they slipping? And is it definitely a floor problem, or are we just actually asking a bit too much of the animal, a bit too much speed?
Thanks, Miriam.
Brilliant. Thank you ever so much for your questions, and thank you to our speakers this evening, Miriam Parker and David Barton, for joining us and sharing your knowledge. Thanks also to Chloe for providing some technical help for us this evening. I've got one more slide just to highlight some more resources, and we've got one more poll for you before we close. So I'm just going to try and move on to my next slide. So AHDB, we've got some resources on cattle handling. We created a manual on improving cattle handling for better returns a few years ago, and Miriam and Chloe have been busy working on an updated version. So if you desperately need a manual now, the current manual's on the website, and in a second we'll put a poll up if you'd like to receive a new manual in the coming months. That will be available. It's also worth mentioning there are some more resources on YouTube on our AHDB pages. So if you go onto YouTube, type AHDB, you can then type in an introduction to cattle handling, and you'll see a video there with Miriam and another strategic farmer, Mark Jelly. And also if you type in AHDB managing outwintered animals, there's a bit of content there, and working with the cow, there's some more content there. So I think Chloe's just opened the final poll. This is a question to ask you whether you'd like to receive the new and updated version of the cattle handling manual. You can click yes, you'd like to receive one in the post. We can download your answers and send that out to you when it becomes available in the coming months. Or you can say yes, and we'll send you a link to the digital version. And if you're not interested, that's fine, you don't need to answer. It's worth saying, if you're watching this back on YouTube and you would also like to see the cattle handling manual, you should be able to see this on our website, or just contact someone at AHDB and they'll be able to provide that for you. Have people answered that now, Chloe?
Yes, thanks. Yep, everyone would like a copy in one way or another, so that's brilliant.
Brilliant. Okay, great. Okay, so thanks again to our speakers this evening. Thanks to everyone for dialing in, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you.